She was 4 years old. She stood 38 inches tall and weighed less than a sack of flour, and she had a laugh that carried clear across the water. On the evening of July 9th, 1979, she slipped out of her family's yard in Birch Landing, Alaska, chasing a neighbor's dog toward the riverbank, and she never came back. That is not a story about a little girl who got lost in the wilderness. That is a story about a man the whole town trusted. A man who joined the search, who called her name into the spruce, who patted her mother's shoulder at the church supper, and then walked home to a cabin 3 doors down. And it would take 45 years, a preserved scrap of a child's jacket, and a website built for people looking up their grandparents to finally put his name to what he did. Records show the case was declared cold in 1983. Everyone in Birch Landing believed the answer had gone into the river with her. It hadn't. It was sitting in a cardboard evidence box the entire time. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the summer the sun never set. Because to understand what that town lost, you first have to understand who Clara Webb was. Birch Landing in 1979 was the kind of place that didn't lock its doors, because there was no reason to. It sat where the Nenochuk River bent hard to the west, a scatter of maybe 400 people, a general store, a 2-room school, a white clapboard church, and a boat landing where every family in town tied up their skiffs. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline had gone through 2 years earlier, and the whole territory still smelled like money and diesel and possibility. But Birch Landing itself never changed much. Men ran traplines in the winter and fished the salmon run in the summer. Women canned what the men caught. The evening news came in fuzzy on a single channel, and the party line rang once for the Websters and twice for the Webbs, and everybody knew whose ring was whose. In July, the sun barely dipped below the ridgeline, so the light stayed gold until nearly midnight, and the children of Birch Landing ran wild in that endless dusk long after they should have been in bed. Clara Webb was the youngest of 3, and by every account the beloved baby of the whole street. Her father, Tom, ran the fuel dock. Her mother, June, taught the little ones their letters at the church on Sundays. Clara had white blonde hair her mother kept in 2 crooked braids, and she was afraid of exactly one thing: the sound the ravens made in the morning, and afraid of nothing else in the world. She carried a stuffed rabbit everywhere she went. She had named it. With a 4-year-old's flat logic, Rabbit, she followed the older kids to the landing to watch the boats. She followed her big brother to the store for penny candy. She followed the neighbor's yellow dog anywhere it went, and the whole town watched out for her. The way that town watched out for everyone. That was the arrangement in Birch Landing. Nobody's child was only their own. In the mornings she helped at the fuel dock, which meant she sat on an overturned crate and handed her father wrenches that were bigger than her forearm. In the afternoons she trailed her brother Danny, who was 9 and pretended to be annoyed and never once left her behind. On Sundays she sat in the front pew and sang the hymns a half-beat behind everyone else, loud and wrong and joyful, and the old women turned around to smile at her. She was, by every honest account, the kind of child who made a whole town feel younger just by running through it. And Birch Landing ran on that trust the way it ran on the tide. You left your skiff untied. You left your door open. You let your 4-year-old chase a dog to the edge of the yard, because the edge of the yard in Birch Landing had always been safe. On the evening of July 9th, June Webb watched Clara toddle to the edge of the yard after that yellow dog, and she called out for her to stay close, and Clara laughed and kept going into the long gold light. That was the last time June Webb saw her daughter whole. At first, nobody was afraid. That was the terrible thing about it. Children wandered in Birch Landing the way children wander everywhere, and the dog always came home, and the town was so small that a missing child usually turned up in someone's kitchen eating someone's cookies. June finished the supper dishes. She stepped onto the porch around 9 and called Clara's name into the yard. No answer. She walked to the neighbors. She walked to the landing. By 10 o'clock she was walking faster and calling louder, and Tom had come up from the fuel dock, and the yellow dog was lying on its own porch. Alone, Rabbit was found at the edge of the tree line where the yard met the path down to the water. Just Rabbit, face up in the grass, its one-button eye pointed at the sky. By 11 the church bell was ringing, and that is a sound no one in Birch Landing forgot. The bell only rang for services and for emergencies, and everyone knew the difference. Men came down to the landing pulling on their boots. Women lit lanterns even though the sky was still bright, because it gave them something to hold. They fanned out along the river and into the spruce, and they called her name until their voices went. The next morning, the Alaska State Troopers flew a man in from the regional post. His name was Ray Bellamy. He was 26 years old, and Clara Webb was the first missing child of his career. He would carry her for the rest of his life. Troopers dragged the slower stretches of the river. Trackers followed the bank for miles in both directions. Bush pilots crisscrossed the country downstream. They found her small shoe on a gravel bar a half-mile down. They found nothing else. Not a footprint that meant anything. Not a scrap of cloth. A 4-year-old had walked into a July evening in a town where everyone knew everyone, and she had come apart from the world completely. Investigators noted at the time that whoever took her had known exactly how much time the endless daylight would give them, and exactly how little anyone would suspect. Ray Bellamy did what a good trooper does. He looked hard at the strangers first. That summer, the pipeline money had brought drifters up every river in the territory. Men chasing cannery work. Men running from something. Men who slept in tents and moved on. Bellamy tracked down every transient who'd passed through Birch Landing that week. One of them, a cannery worker with a record downstate, looked promising enough that Bellamy held him for 3 days. The man had no alibi for the evening and a temper on him, and the whole town decided quietly that he was the one. Then a fish buyer 200 miles away produced a receipt with the man's name and the correct date, and the case against him collapsed in an afternoon. Bellamy tried again. There was a young man in Birch Landing, 19 and strange and friendless, who had been seen near the landing that evening, and for a few days the town turned its fear on him instead. But the boy had been at the cannery on the swing shift, punched in and punched out, with a dozen men who'd stood the line beside him. Another dead end. That was the pattern that summer. A name, a hope, a receipt, or a time card, and the door closing again. And each time it closed, it broke something more in the town's patience. If it wasn't the stranger, then the terrible arithmetic said it was someone they knew. And that was a thought Birch Landing could not hold. So the town did what towns do. It decided, without ever saying so, that Clara had wandered to the river and been carried off by the current, and that the river had simply never given her back. It was a story everyone could live with. It let them keep trusting their neighbors. June Webb never believed a word of it. She had watched her daughter turn away from the water, toward the path, toward the houses, toward town. She said so to Bellamy more than once, quietly, in the kitchen where she still set out 4 plates by mistake. But June was a grieving mother, and grieving mothers were not evidence, and the file grew thin. While the troopers dragged the river, June walked the town. She knocked on every door on the street with a notebook, writing down where each family had been that evening, trying to build with a pencil what the state could not build with a plane. She asked Bellamy to test the scrap of yellow raincoat a tracker had pulled from the brambles. He told her the truth, which was that in 1979 there was nothing anyone could do with it. So it went into the box. Records show that when the fuel dock and the cannery both cut their summer cruise that fall, the last of the searchers drifted away, and the regional post reassigned Bellamy to a string of thefts 3 rivers over. The file did not close so much as starve, and the man everyone trusted the most just kept helping. Meanwhile, the man everyone trusted the most kept helping. Warren Tesler ran the boat landing and fixed every outboard motor in 3 villages and drove the school children when the road washed out. He'd been out on the water within the hour that first night, lantern high, calling Clara's name louder than anyone. He brought a casserole to the Webb's door. He built the little cross the town raised by the church. Investigators would later confirm they never once looked at him. Why would they? Warren Tesler was the man you called when something went wrong. Then, time did what time does. By 1983, 4 years had passed, and the file was formally marked inactive. By 1985, the fuel dock had a new owner because Tom Webb couldn't stand the water anymore. By 1989, the little cross by the church had weathered gray, and the reward flyer in the general store had faded until you couldn't read Clara's name, but nobody ever took it down. The children who had run the search were grown now, with children of their own who knew Clara Webb only as a story their parents wouldn't quite finish telling. June kept Rabbit on the shelf by the door for 45 years. Every July 9th, she set a place at the table. 1 extra plate, 1 small glass, filled and never touched. And she sat with it until the long light finally faded. Danny grew up in a house that had gone quiet. He left for Anchorage at 18 and did not come back for a long time because he had spent his boyhood being the brother who was supposed to watch her and could never forgive himself for the one evening he hadn't. Tom stopped fishing. Then he stopped going to church. Then, in 1985, he sold the fuel dock to a stranger and never again walked down to the water. And June understood, because she couldn't look at the river either. The marriage held, the way old timber holds, bent, weathered, still standing, but never quite the same shape it started as. And Ray Bellamy made sergeant, then retired, and the Clara Webb file went home with him in a cardboard box he kept in his garage in Fairbanks, because he could not bring himself to leave her in a warehouse. He pulled it out every few years and read it cover to cover, looking for the thing he'd missed. He was certain he'd missed something. Memory holds what evidence forgets, and Ray Bellamy remembered a mother in a kitchen saying, over and over, she went toward the houses. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing back together real lives that deserved so much better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like Clara's, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps this work alive. Now, let's get back to Clara, because in 2023, 44 years after a little girl chased a dog into the summer light, a cardboard box was finally opened by someone new. Her name was Nadia Cole, and she worked in the cold case unit the Alaska State Troopers had quietly stood up to run old evidence against new science. She was going through a backlog of unsolved child disappearances when she found Bellamy's box, and inside it, sealed in yellowed paper, was the one thing everyone had forgotten was even saved: Clara's shoe from the gravel bar. And folded beneath it, a small torn piece of a child's yellow rain jacket that a tracker had pulled from a bramble a quarter-mile from the Webb yard in the first week, logged, bagged, and never tested, because in 1979 there was nothing on Earth that could test it. Cole sent it south. The process she used works like this. In plain terms, modern labs can now pull a DNA profile off almost nothing. And when the profile belongs to an unknown person, investigators upload it to the same public ancestry databases where ordinary families trace their roots, and they follow the branches of that stranger's family tree inward until the branches point to one name. The lab called Cole back within weeks. The scrap of Clara's jacket held two profiles. One was Clara's own, enough to confirm, at last, that the jacket had truly been hers. The other belonged to a man who had held that jacket long enough, and roughly enough, to leave himself behind on it. It was a full profile, clean after 45 years in a cardboard box. A profile no one in 1979 had known was even there. Cole handed it to a forensic genealogist and waited. On a gray Tuesday in the spring of 2024, Nadia Cole was watching a genealogist's report come together on her screen, the family tree narrowing, generation by generation, toward a single household on the Nenachuk River. She read the name at the bottom. She read it again. Then she picked up the phone and called a 78-year-old retired sergeant in Fairbanks, and when Ray Bellamy answered, she said only, "You were right." She went toward the houses. After 45 years, a scrap of a raincoat had found its way home. The name at the bottom of that tree was Warren Tesler. He was still alive. He was 81 years old, living upriver in a tidy cabin with a view of the water, a widower, a churchgoer, the kind of old man who waved at every boat that passed. When Cole and two troopers came up his walk, he offered them coffee. Investigators say he did not look surprised. The evidence closed around him the way a current closes over a stone. His DNA was a match to the profile on the jacket. And once the troopers knew where to look, the old story fell apart in the light. Tesler had been 40 in 1979, the man who drove the children, who ran the landing where Clara loved to watch the boats, who had no wife and no children and every reason to be near the water that evening, and who had been the very first man out searching, loud and tireless, steering everyone's attention downstream toward the current while he knew, all along, that the river had nothing to do with it. Records show he had passed the church supper offering plate to June Webb 4 Sundays after Clara vanished. In hindsight, the small things lined up like a row of nails. He had been the one to suggest, early and often, that the poor child must have gone into the water. He had been the one who found reasons to be at the landing whenever the little ones came down to watch the boats. The town had loved him for his helpfulness, and his helpfulness had been camouflage. There had been signs, if anyone had known to read them. He had never wanted a family of his own, but he had always volunteered for the children. The school runs, the summer boat rides, the fishing lessons no one had asked him to give. An old woman, interviewed in 2024, remembered that Warren had stopped coming to the landing when the little ones did, sometime in the early 80s, and that everyone had assumed his knees had simply gone bad. Another neighbor recalled that he had been strangely insistent, in that first week, about which stretch of river the searchers should drag, always downstream, always away. At the time, it had looked like a helpful man trying to think clearly under pressure. In hindsight, it looked like a man steering 400 people away from his own front door. When the arrest went out over the same fuzzy channel that had carried the news of Clara's disappearance nearly half a century before, Birch Landing did not erupt. It went silent. Grown men who had shaken Warren Tesler's hand 1,000 times sat down on their porches and could not speak. He had eaten at their tables. He had carried their own children in his truck. Court documents confirmed that in April of 2024, Warren Tesler was charged in the death of Clara Webb. He entered a plea rather than face a jury of the town he had fooled for 45 years, and he told the court almost nothing, except one sentence that the family will carry for the rest of their lives. He said, "She wasn't scared of me. That was the thing." And the same Dina that named him let the troopers, at long last, quietly confirm what a set of small unidentified remains found downriver years before had never been able to say on their own. Clara Webb could finally come home. Tom Webb did not live to see it. He died in 2011, still unable to look at the river. But June Webb did. She was 91 years old when Nadia Cole sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had set a fourth plate every July for 45 years, and told her that her daughter had never gone into the water, and had never been lost, and had never once been forgotten by the one trooper who kept a cardboard box in his garage because he couldn't leave her in the dark. June did not cry at first. She got up, and she took Rabbit down from the shelf by the door where it had waited all those years. Its one button eye still pointed at the ceiling. And she held it against her chest, and she said, "I always knew she was trying to come home to me." Clara was buried that summer beside her father, under the endless gold light of a Birch Landing July, and half the state came. Ray Bellamy stood at the back with his hat in his hands. The little cross by the church was replaced with a stone. Justice does not always look the way we imagine it. Sometimes it is a very old man in a courtroom and a very old woman holding a stuffed rabbit, both of them arriving at the same truth 45 years too late for it to change anything, and just in time for it to change everything. Because here is what remains. Clara Webb was 4 years old. She had crooked braids and a rabbit named Rabbit, and a laugh you could hear across the water. She was afraid of ravens and nothing else. She followed the older kids and the yellow dog and the boats, and she trusted every single person in that town, because in Birch Landing you were supposed to be able to. Her trust was not a weakness. It was the most human thing about her, and it should have been safe. What was taken from her was a whole life, a first day of school she never had, a wedding, gray hair, grandchildren, an ordinary, long, ordinary blessing of years. And what her mother refused to surrender, across 5 decades in an empty kitchen, was the simplest and most stubborn form of love there is. She never stopped believing her daughter was trying to come home. In the end, a scrap of a raincoat and a stranger's family tree proved her right. So I'll leave you with a few things to sit with. If Warren Tesler had never been asked for his Dina, if that torn piece of jacket had stayed in the dark another 45 years, would this town ever have known who lived among them? How many other people are still out there, still trusted, still waving at boats, whose names are waiting inside evidence lockers for a science that already exists? And what does it mean that the only justice Clara Webb ever received was having a monster's name finally, permanently attached to what he did, decades after he'd already gotten away with a whole quiet life? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and this community always has something worth saying. Justice came for Clara Webb after 45 years. Her story reminds us that the truth, however late, always finds its way back to the light, and that the people who never stop believing are so often the ones who are right. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you as always for being here and for remembering the ones the world tried to forget.